This is the continuation of our Q&A-a-thon. I want to thank Mimi and Glenn and Adam. And thanks also for giving us that, I guess it was Glenn who called it a compass. Although I have to say my compass is spinning slightly after the session. And I do appreciate that none of our Stanford colleagues actually equivocally answered the question. I think two of you punted and said it's both, and one of them wouldn't address it at all. It reminds me of a project I did with the artists Komar and Melamed, who these wonderful Russian post-pop artists who did these surveys, data-based art. They surveyed the American public about what kind of art they want, and most average people can give you a very clear answer. What is your favorite color? How big of a picture do you like? And they have very clear answers. And some 20 years ago, I was asked by the American Society of Aesthetics to do the survey with the experts. So we did the survey. What kind of art do the experts like? And I had to commission Komar and Melamed to make a painting based on the survey results. But the survey results were all completely equivocal. So the academics are like, well, it depends what size of painting I like. So I asked them to do a diptych, two different size paintings, two different colors, and so on. Anyway, I'm not suggesting that we will leave here with absolute clarity, but this is sort of the wrap-up session, not only of this day, but of our incredible week together, which was full of hope about exploring the intersections between technology and museums. And in this session, I'd like to bring it back a little bit to museums. It is true that between the absolutely art-free campus of Apple and Google's campus, where art consists of dinosaurs and camels, I'm not sure that convergence has fully happened yet, but it's early days, as Mimi pointed out. It's still in that early mode. So again, I want to thank again everyone here at Stanford, all of the organizers behind the scenes, front of the scenes at FMSF. This has been quite a lift. And I think just to sort of set the stage for this last Q&A, I think what's been hovering over our 5 days and today is this sort of larger question of sort of how to bring out the promise of the art museum, given the possibilities, given this sort of moment of technological opportunity, as long as we're being optimists about it. And I think a couple of big themes clearly cut through our conversation as regards museums. One, behavior modification will be required. I think everybody understands that the old ways don't all work. But exactly how to adapt remains an open question. Two, artists are the early adopters and institutions are the late responders, and maybe that's okay. And that's not just as regards artists, but as was pointed out, it's also that folkloristic, larger culture, not just the camels and the dinos at the Google campus, but a much more that is sort of bubbling up around us, and we're sort of not quite sure how we should use our system of gates and levies and filters, which are all these bad things that we have, to sort of come to terms with all that richness, because it is very rich. What is clear certainly from the morning presentation is this sort of truly sincere desire to open up the institution and to sort of change the stance, what I like to call moving from this vertical institution that sort of bestows art and expertise, sort of hands it down from the sacred heights of the temple to a more lateral institution that is operating in dialogue with its public, its audience, not for you but with you, as somebody mentioned today, and what Adam called meaningful access, And I think we're all sort of straining to figure out what that is, and to the extent that technology can play a role in that, hooray, that could be a fantastic thing. Perhaps at the heart of this is something that actually combines universities and museums, which is this really nagging question around cultural authority and the authority of expertise, and the institutions that have built walls around that expertise, and while deepening the expertise, also encasing it in not always permeable walls and silos. So how do we reframe things without losing it was, I think, sort of a question that hovered in the air. Sonia actually started us all with that wonderful statement, the museum itself is a technology. And I think we should say it is a wonderful technology, and it's a time-tested technology. It's been around for a couple of 100 years, and it's sort of did pretty well, you know, a couple of world wars, recent pandemic. It's a very adaptable technology, and in ways that Adam, Mimi, and Glenn illuminated, it's a technology that, like all technologies, is in need of an upgrade, or constant upgrade, really. Finally, I think, if I read the room, the jury is a little bit mixed. We have a hung jury on the issue of whether digital technology is going to be the solution to that upgrade. It may be, it may not be, it may be in certain ways, but not others. It may present its own problems. But here I embrace the equivocation or the lack of certainty in the answer. But there's the one thing that we do know, and I think in this we had absolute unity, is that if there is that improvement and that upgrade, the heart of it will be collaboration. Collaboration between museums, collaborations between museums and other disciplines, collaborations with museums and other civil society institutions, and yes, collaborations with the technological industries, which have much to give us, both in tools and maybe even other forms of support. So with all of that in mind, I have a couple of questions. We were hoping, I mean, we've already formed a kind of lovely sort of blended team here. And some people have spoken more than others, so I'm hoping maybe some who have spoken less might be more inclined to answer. But I have a couple of questions, and also a couple of questions came in through the QR code, and I feel we're very technological, by the way, with that. So first question would be, so this whole question of empowering people, we use this term, I think, a lot, maybe overuse it, but I think what we mean by empowering people in the museum is giving them an experience that moves beyond the rigid physical, organizational, and conceptual structures that we sort of prescribe, so that they get to have a little bit more agency to define their experience of the museum. So for those museum directors who are still awake, I'm very curious, what do you feel you need to unlearn in the context of technology and in the context of today's discussion to do that empowerment? What needs to happen differently? What is it that we need to sort of let go of?
Let go of the IT, so that technology is part of the practice of, the workers at the museum, rather than, relying on the expertise of an IT who might not understand what the curator is talking about when he's speaking about a certain artist or a message he wants to convey, for instance. I mean, I would say this is the basic start of reorganizing the work. Yeah.
Maria. And this is reminder, Maria Willis from Bogota.
Yes. So I believe that something really interesting came up, and is that technology put us to think together as museums and leaders, and know that depending on our context, the solutions will be different. And I think that what we learned, and something that was really interesting to me, was to go to gray area and to read their motto, and it said not multidisciplinary, but anti-disciplinary. And I truly believe that listening to all of us, disciplines are what is sometimes, technology for me is going beyond that. So maybe rethinking the way we are labeling our collections, our exhibitions, and going beyond that is something that I think I've learned more than ITs, for example. the narratives, the ways in which we have to bring publics and engage publics. So what I think is beautiful is, since we're not experts in technology, coming to here to talk about technology is more making us think about engaging audiences. Not the technology, but engaging audiences. And I think that's very powerful, because we all have that in common, even if we have very different technological opportunities. Colombia's are not so good. And a question, I wanted to add something. How old is old? Because for us, obsolete things, I mean, I wish we could receive all the things that maybe here in the States are considered obsolete, and we could use it in Colombia perfectly. So it's a question of also this collaboration that we could get from north to south. I want to embrace what we can have and what we have, and maybe the opportunity to recycle and reuse, because all these technological, what we were saying beyond upgrading, maybe I don't want to upgrade, maybe progress is backwards, and that's what I bring from my context.
Sabine, and then Tom.
I think that something I would find interesting to unlearn is to get rid of some of the continuous dichotomies, kind of like the digital against the analog. Digital technology is so, embedded in everything we do. I think it doesn't make sense to always rigidly play the one against the other, or also kind of like human against machine. We learned, with machine learning technologies, it's kind of us with the machine that will be the way towards the future.
Tom? And I think we have a question brewing. What did I see a hand back there? Yeah. Okay. There's a question sprouting over there.
I think that most museums were set up fundamentally as educational centers in the 19th century and the early 20th century. But in the second half of the 20th century, they came under the dominant mindset and leadership of people who were becoming ever more specialized. I'm talking about art museums, ever more specialized as art historians. And the extraordinary advances in knowledge also became a tyranny of expertise. And in the last 20 years, there's been a swing back where museums have been rediscovering their educational role. And then rapidly accelerated in the last 3 years their responsibility as their educational role to a really seriously engaging with a wider audience that they've sort of tiptoed around in the 60s and the 70s and then kind of pulled back from. Now we're really leaning into the sense that we have a responsibility to address wide, diverse audiences. And we have to break through. I mean, I'm a curator. I love curators. But we have to break through the tyranny of the mindset. And to give 2 examples, with the current Gehinder Wiley exhibition, we've worked very closely with community interpreters. That has entirely changed the way we've presented the exhibition. I won't go into that, but I would encourage anyone who's not been to see the show. It really is, for us, groundbreaking in that respect, and a wonderful show. A second example is we're launching tomorrow the catalogue of the Wiesel collection of Native American art, which is like a 400-page catalogue. Normally, in the past, until 5 years ago, this would have been a catalogue with essays by 10 experts who would be comparing these objects to other objects in other museums. Instead, this catalogue has essays by about 30 people that include representatives of the indigenous communities, spiritual interpretations by the makers, and it's a much more broad-ranging approach to the subject. And again, for us, groundbreaking. And I think, to conclude, I think that in this moment, potentially, AI provides us a very cheap and democratic way of breaking through the silos of knowledge and to put information into the hands of our visitors in a very accessible way. as we try to reach these broader audiences.
Great. Some of my best friends are curators too, by the way. There was a question there.
Yeah, well, I mean, my question actually pointed at exactly what Tom said so eloquently, which is about breaking down which types of expertise are centered and honored at our institutions. And, perhaps, to America's point, instead of a senior curator learning how to become more adept at technology, what might it look like for us to unlearn the curator as primary decision maker in all program decisions? So that was just the first question. But then I think the second question is, in the spirit of a rising tide lifts all boats, how might we work more collaboratively and consortially to adopt ways of relating to technologies that are both nimble and responsive, that allow us to move away from this model that each museum must have its own pot of several $1 million in order to engage with emerging platforms?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm curious what some answers are. I'd like to just amplify it because it was exactly the question I was going to ask. Collaboration, a word that just kept coming up all day. What are the missing mechanisms? What would need to be put in the middle of all this to leverage our collective assets? It can't always be Seb. Anyone? Well, then it has to be Seb.
Okay. So I ran the aggregator for the museum collections in Australia from about 2001 to about 2005, and we shut it down. It got taken over by the libraries. And what was interesting about that process was the national infrastructure for that came from the federal government, and when the funding ran out, it stopped. And I think we were that was about a metadata exchange. So it was about standardisation and across all. And in my role, not at the museum, but as the president of the Museums Association in Australia, the sort of sense of lobbying government for a next round of new infrastructure that's publicly owned, and the large museums put money into to fund the small to medium access to those platforms is really important. And it's the infrastructural layer, I think, is really vital. And that infrastructural layer may not be the front-endy things that, the general public gets access to, but allows the museums to build on top of that. So it's finding ways of sharing without wanting to build the monolithic thing, which makes it very hard to fund because a politician wants to cut a ribbon on a building or something, or a donor or a philanthropist, a foundation wants to put their name on a thing. And if the thing is the equivalent of the pipes underneath your bathroom, and there's lots of bathrooms built on top of that, we have to find a new way to do that. And that's why I think it is about collectives across jurisdictions. And I think that's super important because there's different jurisdictional ways of operating. The Australian setup was very inspired by the work going on in Canada in the late sort of 1990s, when the Canadian government financed a whole lot of work. The Virtual Museum of Canada had 2 floors of an office of staff in the 90s before the Conservative government was elected. And it was really interesting because they were running the kind of publishing house that 10 years later, other museums in New York and in San Francisco were trying to run from scratch. Canadians had done it a decade previously, and it was through community networks like Museums in the Web and things like these conference things and things like this too that actually built those intercontinental idea sharings. And I think I think we've run out of, we're all here, but we don't all have good examples to show of these things other than exhibitions as micro products or these little front-end experiences as micro products. And I think that's perhaps the next thing we want to do. Aaron worked on a whole bunch of stuff that we would have loved to roll out across the entire Smithsonian. There were a whole bunch of reasons why that didn't happen, but there was so much a focus on the museums creating a thing that the public could access that we didn't realise that that's built on something else, which is the thing that's got to change. Because the thing that's got to change underneath all that is 20 to 30 years old, and it holds everything else back. We fund new buildings, but we don't fund new plumbing and new ways of working. And that new plumbing has got to be also aware of a desire and a need for that plumbing to service both economic and racial justice. And that infrastructure has politics. So it's going to be really hard to make. But that's where the cross-internationalised version of this, I think, is where there's a great opportunity, but I don't know how the hell we get there. And we all have to do that work, I think.
Gentleman in the face mask.
Sorry. Can you speak to what I've started to think of as a kind of wishful amorality that borders on a double standard around museums not taking a stance about some of the technologies that we're racing towards? You know, we have 10 or 15 years of recent history that basically looks like a tire fire. And a lot of the same people are still pushing new technologies. And museums say, we go where the eyeballs are. And we sort of throw our hands up and shrug and say, what can we do? And this is made all the worse because we are unable to hire and retain staff to do any of this ourselves. And I guess the question is, you know, do we have a responsibility to stand up and say, like, actually, no, we're not going to do that because the people behind it and all of the past actions are problematic?
Is it an answer or a question?
It's kind of a response.
Because you can't answer it in a way, given that you're also in that role.
I probably don't even need a mic. I think, Aaron, that was a beautiful question, and Seb and I are examples, actually, of museum technologists who have come to director positions by leaving some of that wreckage in our own wake, right? No, I mean it. The unsustainable, there's a love affair. You fall in love with an unsustainable system. You make a splash in the field, and then you look down the pike maybe 5 years later, and much of that has been swept under for the next generation to go and reinvent. And I think both that cycle and the impossibility or the perceived impossibilities of museums collaborating in a more federalized way than they do, particularly here in the United States, has to be rooted in the funding landscape for museums here in the States. It is a competitive sport. To provide a unique experience is to gain position within that sport. And so in the end, I think, there is spectacular redundancy in the museum field. We are all customizing systems over and over and over again at tiny scales that are not generally useful at all. And, and it is this kind of fascinating question of why we can't build towards the infrastructure that would both relieve what Aaron's referring to and allow us to focus on our programs. And I think ultimately, as long as there's not a federalized system for actually creating the funding for that, I think we're going to be at loggerheads, unfortunately.
And not only is there redundancy in replicating the same systems, often inadequately staffed or resourced, but we're also looking at technologies now that we can't leverage without collaboration anyway. There was a question or a comment, not a question, a comment here from Amanda.
I mean, regarding this collaboration thing, we also have to acknowledge there's power relationships between museums. I mean, it's not that all museums are equal in that sense, and that there are museums that have the leading conversation and that said what it should be done. Just to put an example, like there's hardly any collaboration between South California museums and Mexican museums. despite that I mean, there's one of the most important Mexican population in California. And I mean, just, well, one initiative was the Pacific Standard Time that Getty founded. But it was like the first initiative in a long, long history. So I think that's also something, for example, this type of roundtable actually is playing in a different way, in the sense that there's people from all over the world, from like smaller or bigger institutions, trying to discuss this, like, because this is the idea that only like super high-end museums can deal with technology, the forefront of technology. But for the rest of the small-scale museums, there's nothing left, you know, because, or the museums that are in the rest of the global south, what is left, because we're just not able to go or like go after that technological advancement. So that, I mean, when we discuss about this, we also have to acknowledge this, because it's not that we live in an even world, you know, like, because, and this plays a very important role. So for me, the question, and part of like, later on in the debrief of the group we're gonna discuss, but for me, one of the relevant things to rethink is what does my museum wants from the digital, you know, like rethink more and more about this. What is the strategic line in which the use of the digital can be useful for my means? Understanding what we all have discussed about, that it's like, how can we engage public, how can we promote education, and all those ulterior goals. But I think it's like really important that like there are spaces when we think of collaboration in that sense also in a different way, in an equal terrain, you know, and that's I mean, that's a political stand, I would say. That is also a political stand. And also a political stand for me, and this might be really, really unpopular, because for like, I'm like very prone into community work, and we do a lot of community work with students, with neighborhoods and everything. But I still believe, and I am also a curator, and I agree with Tom when he says that we should try to have a different mindset. But I would also say that I feel an obligation to bring to the public things that they will not see anywhere else, like critical points of view of the world we live in. Because mass culture and media are totally like, they have the rules of the game, you know, and in that sense, I also think common sense can be profoundly reactionary. So when we say, like, we should put in the museums what people want, what does that really mean? Exactly. Because there's a part of society that is profoundly reactionary. So what are the values we stand for regarding the digital, but also in the way we think about the relationship with our communities, and what because we have agency, as you were saying, we have a lot of agency, and that comes with a lot of responsibility, and dealing with the consequences of putting something out there that has a role, that has a space, and that with like public will be engaging to.
Well, I definitely think that this is a wonderful, thank you, set of thoughts to land on, because it also bridges into our future as this group. We're about to go away and have a separate conversation about where we can take this MTR. When we started on the first day, we noted that as a kind of motto that our institutions are in very different situations. And just in this group, we have organizations ranging from staffs of almost 1,000 to less than 40. With vastly different budgets and very different geographic situations, political situations, operating modalities, and so on. But our problems are very similar. I'm sorry for other questions that may be here, but I'm instructed to bring us to a close. But I think maybe the final note I'd like to end on, other than thanking everyone for this day, is that when we talk about technology there's sort of a assumption that, change is good and constancy is bad. And actually, some of the most interesting comments this week have reminded time and again, not only that there's a lot in the past to appreciate, but that not everything needs to be thrown overboard, that some things don't need to change. The fact that a museum is a special place at the heart of civil society is something we don't need to give up. The fact that however porous and open and low threshold we make the museum, expertise and truth and knowledge have to stand at the middle of it is hopefully something we all know is something we don't want to walk away from. And yes, that even while we provide so many mediated and networked experiences and knowledge-generating opportunities, somewhere at the heart of this endeavor is an encounter between a human being and a work of art. So thank you for coming together for this. This is not the end of the conversation, hopefully the continuation of the conversation. And thank you all for bringing your voices to this very stimulating day. Thank you.